Hey everybody, welcome back to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with James and Steve. This is the channel where we love to talk movies and we do deep dives into the films that you care about. You're here because you love movies. We love movies. Let's get to it. But before I introduce James and the movie of the week, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Dive Movie Reviews and ding that bell so you never, ever miss a video. And hey, we have opinions. You've got opinions. Make sure you're commenting in the boxes below. We want to hear your thoughts. And when do you agree with us? When do you don't? Let's start the conversation. James, what do we got on deck today?
Hey, Steve. This week, we're talking about Jane Campion's Silver Lion Award-winning The Power of the Dog. This is a Western set in Montana in 1925. It stars Benedict Cumberbatch and Jessie Plemons as a pair of brothers who are ranch hands. It also stars Kirsten Dunst and Kodi Smit-McPhee, based on the best-selling novel from the 1960s by Thomas Savage.
And from what I understand, James, this is the rumor mill has this as a Oscar contender.
I reckon so. I mean, it came straight out of Venice where it scored very highly, won the Silver Bear for Best Director for Jane Campion. She has incredibly good pedigree. She was, for a long time, one of the only women to have won the Palme d'Or for the piano back in '93.
Yeah, well, long time back.
Yeah, right. And the piano scored well at the Oscars that year. She was nominated for Best Director. Holly Hunter won.
Yep.
What's the little girl called? Anna Paquin. Anna Paquin,
yes, Anna
won,
Paquin.
Who then became an X-Men, and Kodi Smit-McPhee has been an X-Man as well. And so, yeah, she comes with a certain degree of pedigree. And also, yeah, it seems like in a year when right now we're recording on the 10th of December. Right now, it seems that the Oscar race, the awards race, is wide open right now. There isn't any kind of clear front runner whatsoever. And I think particularly in the major categories, picture, director, adapted screenplay, and particularly for Benedict Cumberbatch, I think this one is certainly going to be in the running.
Very much so. I couldn't agree more. I think there's plenty of room for somebody to come in because nobody, I think, has really clinched it this year. And after I watched this movie, obviously we've got our thoughts about this, but this is the kind of movie that the Academy loves to honor. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of nominations for it.
I think so. You know, it's a very sort of old-fashioned movie in one sense. You know, it is a Western, you know, there's got that whole sort of pioneering thing going on. But on the other hand, it's quite a modern story. You know, it tackles a number of themes that, you know, would have been out of the question to have talked about as recently as sort of 20, 30 years ago. So it feels like it really bridges those two worlds incredibly well. And that's the kind of thing that I think awards voters, particularly now, are really going to be looking out for.
Well, you call it a Western, but I see it almost as the anti-Western. There was not one bar fight. I don't think a gun was fired in this movie. If there was, it was maybe when the cattle drive and it was into the air or something like that.
Right.
But there was no violence. There was none of the traditional Western tropes that you see. This movie was in many ways a anti-Western film, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think that, yeah, maybe it's more of a sort of a frontier drama than an actual sort of Western. I hadn't really thought about it. You know, I saw, you know, mountains and plains and cattle and horses and men in Stetsons on horseback. And I was like, Western. But yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it actively avoids a lot of those very sort of familiar and overworked tropes of the genre to be something more.
And it's unfortunate that I watched it on Netflix because I have heard that there is a theatrical run of this in limited release in various parts of the world. But by and large, people are going to see this movie on Netflix, as I did, and I assume as you did. And this movie is of a grand scale. There is vistas, there's cinematography that I wish I had seen in the big cinema rather than in my living room.
Yeah, no, it is a great shame that I mean, it's great that it's on Netflix in as much as it's easily accessible for pretty much everyone wherever you are. But yeah, I mean, if there was a film that needed to be seen on the big screen this year, this is certainly one of them. I mean, there's such a sense of sort of, yeah, like grand, epic scale, the great outdoors, you know, the isolation that comes with vast expanses of emptiness. the loneliness of frontier life. All of those things are only accentuated when you see them blown up really big, and the cinematography in this film is gorgeous as well.
And maybe I'm a little biased here though, but they filmed this. It's supposed to be in the American West, but they filmed this in New Zealand, which is Jane Campion's. She's a Kiwi.
She is,
and New Zealand's beautiful. I mean, we've all seen Lord of the Rings, but even as I'm watching some of those vistas, I'm fairly familiar with the American West and what it looks like. And yes, some things can double, but I kept being reminded, this is not this is beautiful. This is gorgeous. It's stunning. It's eye candy. It's majestic. But there was a part of me that kept, but that's not really the American West.
Okay. I mean, you, I imagine, more familiar with the American West than I am. And I did know that it was shot in New Zealand, but I think I was transported, I think I bought into it. I think, it just looks so epic, it does look so beautiful. And I think that the story and the performances and everything else was so sort of authentic. It was one of those films for me, certainly, where no one really puts a foot wrong, that I was sucked into that world, that I never really sort of questioned anything like that. Actually.
Right. So what are your initial thoughts, James? What are you, what are we looking at with Power of the Dog?
Well, I mean, I think we've already kind of shown our hand to a degree that, I thought it was fantastic. I really did. I think it's one of my favorite films of the year so far. And a lot of that is because it can sort of persistently defied my expectations. I didn't know anything about it going in. I haven't read the novel upon which it's based. All I knew was it was Benedict Cumberbatch doing a Western. Really.
Right.
And we've already established that it might not even be a Western. But, and I heard that he was kind of a bit of a nasty piece of work. By, the end of Act 1, I had a pretty good idea of where I thought it was going to go. But then in the second half of the film, it just sort of wrong-footed me again and again in sort of the best possible ways. It became a far more sort of nuanced and layered character piece than I was expecting. I thought he was just going to become Phil, his character was just going to become increasingly terrible and overbearing and tormenting young Peter, and it was all going to end horribly and bloodily for pretty much all involved. Yet it doesn't go that way. I mean, it's tragic. I think it's fair to say, and it's a sad story at the end of the day, but it's sad for so many other reasons. And I think the biggest surprise for me is how it attempts, at least, to change your perspective on Phil, on the main character. That it asks you, if not necessarily to sympathize with him, it definitely asks you or invites you to be empathetic to his life and his struggles.
This is, I don't know at what point do we go spoiler free here. I think up to this point, we've been pretty vague and just kind of, for somebody watching this, we haven't, explored some of the themes in some of the areas. Like yourself, I had very limited understanding of where we were going in this movie. And then I started to think, are we going Brokeback Mountain territory? Okay. But then it was much more nuanced than that. There was it didn't really go Brokeback Mountain. It went much more ambiguous. There was layers here. And even at the end of the movie, I was left with, I wasn't sure about every aspect of what I'd just seen.
Yeah, I like the fact that it's not so much that it leaves the ending ambiguous, because I don't think it is ambiguous, but it doesn't spoon feed you, exactly the step-by-step elements of what has happened. Right. It kind of drops enough clues, and you slowly start to realize that things you've seen half an hour ago or 45 minutes ago were not what necessarily all that you thought that they were. There was something else going on, but I think it gives you the opportunity to piece it together in your head, and come to the sort of horrifying realization of who is who and what has taken place. Who's
the good guys, who's the bad guys, and who's the nebulous gray area guys, and all
the and all the clues were there.
Yes.
In hindsight, when you look back, you're like, oh, but of course, this and this and this and this. But at the same time, it doesn't show you. It's not like the end of, I don't know, The Usual Suspects or something, where it's just this montage of flashbacks going, see, look, this clue, this clue, this clue, this clue. It just lets it sit there and lets you do the work in your own way, in your own time.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you said, it's not ambiguous, but you have to do your due diligence. It's not going to, as you say, spoon feed you. Well, James, before we go any further, how about a brief synopsis? Tell the viewers what they're going to see or what they have seen in Power of the Dog.
Okay, yeah. So it's set in Montana in 1925, and you have two brothers, Phil and George Burbank, played by Benedict Cumberbatch and Jessie Plemons. They couldn't be more different. They're both ranchers. They've kind of inherited a ranch, and they run it together. Phil is sort of the salt of the earth, rugged, cowboy, essentially, whereas George, Jessie Plemons' character, is far more reserved. He's quieter, he's less gregarious, to the point of being almost sort of catatonic. And he's far more interested in sort of dressing well and socialite, being a socialite, and the status that this degree of wealth brings them, rather than doing the work. And it's caused ongoing friction between the two brothers. They still travel together, they still work together, but there is a definite sort of clash of characters between the two of them. The things come to a head when they meet a young woman called Rose, played by Kirsten Dunst, who runs kind of a tavern in the middle of nowhere with her son, Peter, played by Kodi Smit-McPhee. Phil takes an instant dislike to her, but George is instantly smitten and very quickly marries her and brings her and her son back to the ranch. And really, that's kind of where the action sort of begins to unfold, is the sort of the pressure cooker of friction, if you like, between Phil, who just has no interest in this woman or this boy, he
actually thinks that she's after his money. That's
right. Yeah, that she's kind of like been plucked from the middle of nowhere, and that she's only married in order to get the money, and obviously half of any money is his, and there's this like very sort of wet behind the ears, sort of effeminate young man here, who is sort of a sorry excuse for a cowboy, you could say, and it kind of goes from there. It's about the this kind of sort of pressure cooker of personalities, and how things develop and how things unfold. And as we've already mentioned, it doesn't necessarily sort of explode in the ways that you think it's going to.
Well, the first thing that strikes me, James, is this is really a vehicle for Benedict Cumberbatch. Kirsten Dunst, Jessie Plemons, these are all secondary characters to Benedict Cumberbatch's Phil. And everything revolves around Phil's interactions with his brother, his interactions with his new sister-in-law, his interactions with his new, step nephew?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Who you could just see he despises because of his effeminate nature. But what really struck me is you have these key stars who are really, really secondary to Benedict Cumberbatch. And this is his vehicle. This movie is all rests on his shoulders, and he carries it.
Absolutely. I mean, we're used to seeing Benedict Cumberbatch. He's a versatile performer, but when I heard about this, I was like, okay, well, this is going to be a real sort of stretch for him, or a new challenge for him. I think he's perfectly capable of doing it, and I think he does it incredibly well. But I think, this was definitely something new. He's obviously Doctor Strange and Sherlock, that's what a lot of people know him for. But beyond that, he tends to play sort of real historical figures, mostly sort of British sort of politicians, right, or scientists or whomever. And he does this a lot on the big screen and on the small screen. And so for him to play a kind of early 20th century American rancher, that was immediately like, oh, hang on a minute, this is something different. And as the film unfolds, I'm thinking, I kept having this question in the back of my mind: what does Benedict Cumberbatch see in this role that differentiates him just from being kind of like a grizzled cowboy? And I think that the great it becomes immediately apparent,
Mm-hmm.
in the second half of the film, when you realize that it's telling a very different story to what you thought.
Right.
I think part of his revulsion to Peter's character is sort of bolstered by the memory of his mentor figure, which was this
Mm-hmm.
guy called Bronco Henry, who he has a shrine sort of dedicated to in the stables, and you get the impression that he was like the ultimate good old boy kind of guy who taught him how to ride a horse and how to wrangle cattle and all the rest of it. But it's a discovery that Peter makes when you suddenly realize, well, hang on, Bronco Henry wasn't that man at all, but was a very, very different kind of man, and has actually influenced Phil's life in a much different way to what we thought.
A very intimate way. And what I thought was interesting too was and I think to answer your question about what drew Benedict Cumberbatch to this role, was this is not a traditional guy's guy, bad guy, cowboy. It's constantly referenced. This guy understands music. He understands high society. Actually, that Western bravado is actually a camouflage for a very deep intellectual wrestling with his sexual orientation, among other things. And this Western bravado is his mask.
Yeah, it's his shield. It's a defense mechanism, if you like. They said that he was schooled in the classics. When his parents come over with the governor for this dinner that George has arranged in order to show off his new wife, which goes horribly, they're far more excited about Phil being there because he's the great raconteur. He's the great, or was the great conversationalist and all the rest of it. And you start to realize that maybe actually Phil used to be more like Peter. Yeah, so what we first read to be sort of antagonism against Peter, you come to realize is actually more sort of compassionate than that. He's not like, I'm going to eat you alive kind of thing. Who do you think you are? But it's more like, oh, you need protection, or you need training. You need to be better equipped for this way of life if you're going to survive.
Right. I think initially the reaction that he had to Peter is because it reminded him of his own internal struggles, and he doesn't want that bubble popped. But then I think it did begin to morph into that situation you just described, where I'm going to give you the tools that you're going to need to survive. If you're going to be this guy inside doesn't survive in this environment. You've got to have this mask going. But there was also a measure too, when Peter discovers his little secret shrine out in the middle of the forest there, which, this is a spoiler show, he discovers the shrine that Phil has to Bronco Henry. And it obviously there's basically the old version of pornography.
Sure. Gay pornography,
muscle man
magazines,
from the 1920s, and it has that, So obviously, then the penny drops, and we're understanding a little more about Phil. But Peter reveals that he stumbles upon Benedict Cumberbatch, Phil, as he's having an intimate time with himself with Bronco Henry's scarf.
Right.
And so it got me wondering, James, is part of him taking under his wing also, oh, he knows my secret, and now I've got to make sure he doesn't share it. I have to at least pretend to be, bringing him into the fold more than antagonistic to him. I wasn't sure there which way they were going.
Right. I was so scared for young Peter in that moment, because I was like, oh, now the secret is out. Yeah. You're going to be like his target now, his predatory target. and he is going to have his wicked way with you in the barn or whatever, and we're going to go down that slippery slope that may even end in, I was envisioning like Peter hanging himself with this rope that was being made for him, and I just thought, okay, things are just going to go horribly, horribly wrong from here on out. Whereas it doesn't go that way at all.
Not at all. Yeah.
It kind of goes the opposite way. And what you only realize in the end is that actually Peter, I think, has no homosexual inclination. I don't think he does. I think that when he realizes essentially what Phil's weakness is, mm-hmm. Peter starts playing the ultimate kind of long game, which you only kind of realize in the dying moments of the film, like, oh wow, you've been shown these glimpses of his darkness, and they're kind of passed off early on as sort of bookish idiosyncrasies, if you like, eccentricities, that he's in. He wants to go to college and be a surgeon, and they at one point they catch a rabbit and they bring it home as a pet, only to discover that he's taken it up to his room and dissecting it.
Yeah, he definitely there's a part in his brain that's cut off, and it's also not inferred, it's clued in that when he says to Phil, my father often said I wasn't kind enough, and Phil makes fun of him, like, oh, you're just a feminine boy, that's nonsense. But it's another clue that this guy Peter has a dark side that is just waiting to come out, and he can be extremely callous and extremely cold when he needs to be. And we haven't really shared the motivation for the reason why he ultimately dispatches Phil, is because of the effect that Phil's having on his mother. It's driving her to into spiraling alcoholism, into a spiraling depression, and he is witnessing this. And again, as you said earlier, we're left at the end of this going back and remembering these points where Peter was seeing this. He was observing this and the effect that Phil was having on his mother and his mother's relationship with George. And suddenly the penny drops and you think, oh, okay, this guy, like you said, he's had the long game going.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't Peter sort of defending himself so much as... getting rid of this poisonous element in the household.
If anything, I would even reason that if it had only been antagonism to Peter, it wouldn't have bothered him as much, because I don't think he would have cared that. Well, I mean, that's arguable, but really it's the impact on his mother that sets things in motion.
That's certainly the primary motivation. And I mean, I want to talk a little bit about those scenes where Phil is antagonizing Rose. I mean, you see clear sort of parallels with Jane Campion's earlier film, The Piano, which was about, a woman and her child from a previous marriage going to a sort of being married off to a desolate, remote part of the world where she has to suffer, and all she has is a piano. And that is exactly the story that actually Rose goes through here. She's taking her son Peter to a remote place after being married off, and yes, he's wealthy, but there are problems going on there. And she only has, he gives her this piano after learning that she can kind of play. Turns out she can't really play sort of half as well as she had sort of said, or that he thought. But there's this wonderful scene where she's desperately trying to practice ahead of this dinner where she's going to sort of ultimately embarrass herself. And Phil, who plays the ukulele or the banjo, is upstairs and starts kind of mimicking her. And it becomes increasingly sort of threatening, and it reminded me of the scene in Deliverance. The dueling banjos in Deliverance, and they're playing a very kind of similar tune as well. It's a very simple kind of almost childish kind of show tune, and he's not face to face, but he's upstairs in his room, but with the door ajar, and he's just staring down the stairwell at her.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just like really going at it, playing the tune much better than she is. And I was just like, oh my God, this is like the hillbillies in Deliverance. It's incredibly intimidating.
That's a good connection point. Deliverance. I hadn't thought about that.
And I think, and that's the kind of torment that he's putting Rose through. It's not sort of physical, sustained abuse. It's not really verbal abuse that much either. It's just this nasty, poisonous presence that he emanates, in the house. He's very much the third wheel now that his brother has married off, and he knows that his place in the family home is threatened now. It's only a matter of time almost before he'll have to move out. If they start having kids and what have you, they're building a family together. And he just becomes this kind of sort of cancer in the home that, drives her to the drink, basically.
Yeah. He definitely emanates bad vibes throughout the whole thing. And I think there's one, I was a little bit disappointed in the end because there was things I wanted to see. Not that I need everything explained to me, but I really wanted to know more of why is he classically trained? Why is he know music? Why is he basically high society? But what was the turning point? What was the thing that caused him to become this angry, bitter, I've got to lash out, I've got to create problems? Like I'm never quite given that explanation. And it seems there's always inferred that something occurred, that he was one way and now he's this way, but we're left with no explanation. And I was kind of hoping, I was guessing and telling Tammy, I watched this with Tammy, the Jessie Plemons character, he's going to be the killer. Like it's going to be turn out that he's not the guy that we thought he is. He seems like this very chilled, monotone, and they're going to do a flip on the brothers, and it's going to be the real bad guy is the Jessie Plemons, and the classically trained, they're going to switch roles. They didn't go that route at all.
No, they still kind of upended your expectations, but it wasn't George, it was Peter. It is interesting, isn't it? Because you get the impression that that their parents would have quite encouraged him to go into like a more studious profession rather than tend to the ranch. But whether it was directly, whether Bronco Henry was directly responsible, or at what period, I can't remember if you're told specifically when he first meets Bronco Henry, whether it's when he's already decided to run the ranch, or whether he brings him in. But certainly, that was where the problem started. He had made the decision and he realized that he was ill-equipped, and that Bronco Henry, for want of a better expression, kind of broke him in and led him down this path where, you could be the person that you wanted to be. With Bronco Henry, he could, but he had to hide it from absolutely everybody else. Look at the other ranch hands who were around him, who were typical sort of yeehaws, kind of cowboys,
right? And
they're the ones who ultimately are tormenting Peter,
right?
And they think they're doing it to please Phil almost. They think they're following his lead and doing it to please him, whereas actually I think Phil very quickly realizes that he's almost responsible for bringing this upon Peter, and that he has to maneuver this and protect him.
Indeed. James, I can't go longer without talking about the music in this movie.
Right. For sure.
Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead. At what point Tammy made a nice observation. She said, I wonder how I would feel in this movie if you turn the sound off, if you turn the music off. And it really hit me that there is this resonance in the music. There is this it actually creates a very strong emotion while I was watching. It creates suspense. It creates obviously scores in movies are meant to do that, but I found this score particularly unique and fitting for the movie and the atmosphere it was trying to create.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly unsettling, isn't it? I think Johnny Greenwood's quite good at this. I think he's found his niche in the movie world.
Post Radiohead.
Exactly. And Yeah, he does. He creates this very sort of unsettling, unwelcoming sort of sense of uneasiness where you can't relax, especially in a film where music features quite a lot. And as we've said, there are instruments being played by certain characters, and therefore far more kind of basic, well-known songs and tunes and all the rest of it. That there is this kind of just haunting, jarring, creaking kind of eerie sound. It's more like almost like a soundscape than
it's
than
unsettling.
Score.
It's unsettling,
and it just never lets you relax. And I think that's the theme of this movie, is that this is a story of people who have never felt comfortable in the world, never felt comfortable in their station. And I think Greenwood's score really puts us in that sort of frame of mind.
No, and I think that's one of the reasons this movie is not a slam dunk for me. As much as I enjoyed elements of it, and it's more personal taste, and that no one experiences any joy in this movie. True. From Jessie Plemons' character to Kirsten Dunst, that I think the only moment we actually see happiness and joy is when Benedict Cumberbatch is dead and Peter is watching his mother with Jessie Plemons, and you could see that everything is now right in the world. You do get a momentary glimpse that hope and joy is now possible now that Phil has been dispatched. But up until that moment, it's like this presence of Phil is like a toxin which seeps into the relationships of everybody. It seeps into the parents' relationship and the community's relationship and the brothers' relationship, and even when the governor's over, it's just this toxic radioactivity. And Peter identifies what the source of this toxicity is, and he dispatches it.
Ironically, using poison. Phil is like renowned for being really good at avoiding those anthrax that can kill off the entire herd of cattle, and yet he is exactly that same poison to the family.
Yes.
It's funny that you talk about that final moment as like the only glimmer of happiness, but it's funny because Phil has been dispatched, but at the same in the same breath, you are realizing as a viewer that Peter's an absolute monster.
Yes.
And you're like, oh goodness, he's a murderer, and he's loose and he's free and he's capable of doing it undetected in a way that nobody would ever suspect him of.
No.
He walks away absolutely scot-free. And yes, his life, his mother's life may well now be happier and better for it. But he has also now realized that he is capable of murdering and can get away with it. So who knows, where his future lies.
Yes. Yeah. And he was willing to, in that long game, to really play up. I agree with you. I don't think Peter was gay at all. But I think he was willing to play up being an object of desire to Phil, to basically bring him into his web. And that's what, in hindsight, some of the brilliance of this movie only comes in hindsight.
I think so. Because I think you were talking about like the moment of happiness. For me, the happiest moment, in inverted commas, in the movie is right towards the end, where Phil and Peter share that cigarette. Mm-hmm. It's like the last night, and they're finishing. He's just given him the bit of hide that he got from the cow to finish the rope, and there's this look of sort of peace and contentment in Phil's eyes for the first time ever. Mm-hmm. And Peter is really flirting with him hard. And they're sharing a cigarette, and you're like, oh, it's a beautiful shared moment of, there's some lust in there, but there's also just this recognition and acceptance, and recognition more than anything else. You're just like, oh, this has been a surprise, but maybe there is a happy future ahead for these two. No, next morning he's dead.
Boom.
And you're like, okay, yeah, that was all a ruse.
Yeah.
So this is a film that I loved it because it's a film that consistently just surprised me. Like some of the characters, reeled me in, and then threw, completely upended me and my expectations. I didn't do anything like I expected it to. It kind of went in the completely opposite direction, and it was all the better for that.
No, and that's the thing is that, I referenced earlier, I thought, oh, is this at one point, is this going to go Brokeback Mountain? Are they going to have this affair? And they didn't go that direction. They continually, like you said, they upended my expectations. It was always much more layered, much more nuanced, much more, you really needed the hindsight to be able to appreciate this movie and some of the brilliance in it. So, well, James, obviously our comments are drawing this to a close. Do you have any final thoughts? And then what are you going to score The Power of the Dog?
For me, it really is one of my favorite films of the year, I think. And if you get the opportunity to see it on the big screen, don't miss it, because it won't hang around if it is in a cinema. But it is on Netflix, so everybody should have access to that. Do check it out. It is a beautiful film. It's a tough watch at times, but not necessarily in the ways that you think it's going to be. I think it challenges you and it defies your expectations. And I think it I think it fights for empathy and compassion on behalf of difficult characters, and challenging characters. And I think that is incredibly sort of applaudable. And all the the other traditional aspects of it are great. It's great writing, it's great performances, it's beautifully shot, and as we've said, the music's great. So I'm gonna give it a full five pieces of rope out of 5.
Wow. I think that is possibly your first 5 on Deep Dive Movie Reviews.
I think it is.
It's the first 5.
Not even James Bond got 5.
Not even James Bond got 5. I think you enjoyed it more than I did. I liked it. I love that they broke the tropes of the Western. I love being surprised. I thought Benedict Cumberbatch, I like him in just about everything. I'm a huge Sherlock fan. And to me, this just expanded his already widening body of wonderful work. And he's still young, and we're going to have a ton more movies from him to enjoy. So I'm going to give this movie 4 homespun lassos because yes, I think this is a great film, but I do have some reservations. I always struggle when everybody operates in a way that I wouldn't operate at all myself, like trying to figure out what is the motivation for this, why are you doing this, why do you act like this. There's not a character in this movie that I can identify with. Not that that's always needed, but I think sometimes in order for me to get it a 5, it's got to be something that I can identify with, and I'm going to come back and rewatch this movie. I'll probably watch this movie one other time again to kind of get that hindsight view, but this is not something where I'm going to be watching, hey, tonight, honey, why don't we watch The Power of the Dog again?
Yeah, it's not exactly a fun time. I'll admit that, but I think it's so substantive. Netflix were kind enough to actually send me a copy of the novel, so I might actually have a read of that and just see how close. I get the feeling it's a pretty close adaptation.
Interesting.
I'll be interested to see what the original material is like. But as I'm getting older, I'm becoming increasingly drawn to the Western just as a genre. I think it's one of those genres that benefits a life experience, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's going to wrap it up for Deep Dive Movie Reviews for this week. James, thanks again so much. And hey, just a reminder, subscribe, comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. Until next week, James.
Goodbye.